In a previous series of videos, we examined the various aspects of fascism as an ideology. In this series of videos, I would like to now compare and contrast fascism and communism, with the contention that both ideologies are very, very similar to one another, especially when one examines the ideas of the ideologies as well as the actions such ideologies took when in power. Both ideologies, quote, share the same animosities, idiosyncrasies, neuroses, and phobias. They resent the grayness of liberal democracy and abhor the Philistine mediocrity of bourgeois existence, unquote. While the two ideologies expressed direct antipathy towards one another and competed directly for the same power base, they were still extremely similar to one another. Historians Ernst Nolte and Renzo de Felice suggest that fascism and communism were, quote, brother enemies, unquote. After a close examination, one will find that the communist regimes all possess the key aspects of fascism previously discussed: nationalism, populism, militarism, totalitarianism, anti-liberalism, anti-democracy, anti-free markets, an emphasis upon the importance of the leader, and terrorism were all key aspects of communist movements the world over. The Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, as well as the other nations of the communist bloc, all had these characteristics. While they claim to be communists, examining their words and deeds will lead one to find that, in many ways, they were arguably fascist. This comparison was noted in the World Book Encyclopedia's article on fascism. Quote, the Soviet Union claimed to be a democracy, but it had many fascist characteristics, including the police state, militarism, and extreme nationalism, unquote. The following videos will explore the ways in which communist regimes fell within the rubric of fascism, namely, how they had many of the same key features that were explored in the other series of videos. Due to the nature of communism, there are some features that do not need to be discussed in too much depth because it is so apparent that the communists reflected those features. For instance, it is common knowledge that the communists were opposed to free markets and capitalism. It is so apparent that it hardly bears repeating. It is common knowledge to anyone interested in the study of history or world affairs. Similarly, it should be apparent that communism put an inherent emphasis upon unity, populism, socialism, and of course, revolution. Because of this, these aspects of communism will be discussed briefly in this video, particularly the way in which they were similar to the fascist regimes. The inherent populism of communism can be seen very clearly in their rhetoric. There is an emphasis upon the proletariat, specifically industrial workers. Given the time period wherein communist ideas were popularized, many of these workers were undereducated and lacked political rights or representation. For instance, in the United Kingdom, it took over a century of protest and reform before the country gained universal suffrage. A 1780 survey found that only 3% of the population of the United Kingdom had the right to vote. It was only following 3 acts of parliament over the course of 50 years that most white men gained the right to vote. Even then, there were limitations. The 1832 Reform Act, for instance, only gave the vote to men in towns who, quote, occupied property with an annual value of 10 pounds, unquote, which still excluded 85% of the population. 35 years later, after the Reform Act of 1867, 40% of the male population was still excluded. Arguably, universal suffrage for all persons in the United Kingdom was not achieved until 1918. Similarly, such restrictions to suffrage were also seen in the United States. It was not until 1856, nearly 70 years after the nation's founding, that all white men were allowed to vote. Even then, women and African Americans were still excluded for decades afterwards. Even after the passage of the 14th Amendment, African Americans had their rights to vote severely curtailed for a century. This is all somewhat ironic when one considers that, quote, no taxation without representation, unquote, had been the rallying cry of the American Revolution. Given the lack of representation given to the working men of various countries, communist agitators very much painted themselves as fighting for the common man. As Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, quote, "The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority," unquote. Karl Kautsky, commenting on the Communist Manifesto in the early 20th century, made the argument that the working class was made up of the vast majority of European society and that the proletariat was the, quote, "only class that pushes with all its strength for social progress," unquote. In the same writing, Kautsky argued that the working class was continually being subjugated and having their rights stripped from them. Historian Sheila Fitzpatrick notes directly that the Bolsheviks claimed to represent the proletariat and defined the term rather broadly. Quote, "The Bolsheviks' chosen base of social support, and since 1917 they had defined the proletariat for all practical purposes as Russia's workers, soldiers, sailors, and poor peasants," unquote. Stalin once remarked in 1937, quote, "Bosses come and go. Only the people is eternal," unquote. While in practice, the communist regimes not only stripped workers of their rights, as will be discussed in a later video, but also lowered their standards of living. Nevertheless, in their rhetoric, the communists were avowedly populist. They avidly claimed to be fighting for the little guy and the common person. This populism can also be seen in the names that the communist regimes and movements gave themselves: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the People's Republic of China, Lao People's Democratic Republic, Socialist People's Republic of Angola, People's Republic of Angola, People's Republic of Bukharan, People's Soviet Republic, Polish People's Republic. The list continues. Connected to this populism, the communists openly and actively supported the idea of unity. The ending line of the Communist Manifesto is iconic in this regard. Quote, "Workers of the world, unite," unquote. The entirety of the global proletariat needed to unite together against the global bourgeoisie. Only then could the socialist revolution take place and dismantle capitalism in favor of the dictatorship of the proletariat. After all, quote, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win," unquote. This sense of unity is inherent to the communist ideology, particularly as it is a populist movement and will be explored further, particularly as it helped to inform communist totalitarianism. Furthermore, as is well known, the communists were vehemently opposed to free markets and to capitalism. What is often overlooked, however, is just how similar the communists and the fascists were on this matter, especially when one compares Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Both the Soviets and the Nazis were extremely isolationist in terms of international trade. Both were striving for the goal of autarky. In both nations, trade declined massively in the 1930s. It declined upwards of 66%. Furthermore, economic controls were extended across whole sectors and pervaded every aspect of life. In both nations, crimes of so-called economic sabotage became subject to harsh punishments. In both nations, increasingly, the only free markets were black markets. Questioning of central economic planning was strongly discouraged. In the Soviet Union, quote, "The head of Gosbank, the state central bank, was shot in 1936 after he suggested a relaxation of economic controls," unquote. In following the central plans, consumer spending declined as state budgets increased. At a given point, the Soviet regime was the largest single customer in the entire Soviet economy. Similarly, the Nazi regime ate up most of Germany's resources. Both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were command economies that rejected liberal free markets for the goal of autarky. They had more in common with each other than differences. Historian Richard Overy observes this comparison very directly. He writes, quote, "Under dictatorship, the two became varieties of command economy, subject to coercive economic direction by state agencies, in which the motor force of economic development was supplied not by the market, but by the target policies of the regime," unquote. While these comparisons are directly between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, similar comparisons can be made between fascist and communist nations writ large. There are but a few ways in which the communists and fascists were similar. Vladimir Tismanu, a Romanian historian, notes these similarities directly. Tismanu writes, quote, "The inner core of deep anti-capitalist, anti-liberal, and anti-democratic obsessions could be found in both of these otherwise inimical doctrines," unquote. The comparison, however, is still incomplete. The following videos will explore the ways in which communism and communist regimes and movements were similar to the fascists in terms of nationalism, militarism, totalitarianism, anti-liberalism, anti-democracy, anti-individualism, an emphasis on the importance of the leader, and terrorism. The following analysis will demonstrate that fascism and communism are extremely similar.